All right, everyone. This is Lisa McKay from the Avoca Group and the Avoca Quality Consortium. We're excited to see so many people have joined us this morning for the webinar on how companies are transforming clinical operations in light of ICH E6 R2. It's certainly a popular topic and one which has captured the interest of so many people in our industry as we move forward and try to meet these new requirements. Before we get started, I would just like to tell you that this is a joint presentation between the Avoca Quality Consortium and Navitas Life Sciences. We have a speaker from each company, and we're very delighted to have Navitas with us today. First, before we get started, I would like to just give you a little bit of information to explain for those of you on the call who may not yet be familiar with the Avoca Quality Consortium what it is. And this is the backdrop for the information and knowledge that's presented that Chrissy will be sharing with you today. So what is the Quality Consortium? It's an industry collaborative consisting of pharma and biotech companies, CROs, and other types of providers that work in the clinical trial execution space. It's focused on operationalizing proactive approaches to quality and risk management, and again, with such heavy collaboration that really makes all of this possible. We have over 80 members at present who have joined the Avoca Quality Consortium, and it's a varied group of the largest companies in the industry and small to mid-sized organizations on both the pharma and service provider side. So if you work for a company that's part of our membership and you don't have the credentials and access to the AQC Knowledge Center, please reach out to us. We have hundreds of leading practice documents, tools, guidelines, and standards that our members are able to access and utilize. And for those of you who are not, certainly if you would like for your organization to be part of us, please let us know. So Avoca started the Quality Consortium about 7 years ago, and over that time we have worked on many different initiatives focused on improving and streamlining clinical trial execution. We don't consider any initiative that we undergo to be static or completely done. We continually update documentation as regulations change, and we're always adding new work streams. And one of the biggest parts of the updates and the additions are the direct work with our members within the collaboration. So let me introduce you to our speakers. Chrissy McDonald is Executive Director of Client Delivery for the Avoca Group, and Janet Bernhow is Senior Consultant with Navitas Life Sciences. So what I'd like to do is just turn it over to Janet for a moment to introduce Navitas, and then we will turn it back over to Chrissy to start the presentation.
Excellent, thank you. And just as a reminder to the panelists, please make sure your phone's on mute if you're not speaking to avoid any feedback. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. For some of you who may have registered quite a while ago, you may have seen a slide like this with Herschel Thompson's face and name on it as well. For reasons beyond all of our control, he's not able to make it today. But I think it's quite auspicious that you have an all-female panel for International Women's Day, which is completely fantastic. So on to the next slide, you can see that Navitas Life Sciences is a global company. We are the result of a merger of 3 companies, which gives us amazing experience, not just in consulting, which we've had for quite a while, but we also have a CRO for clinical trial services, regulatory submissions group in Colombia, so we can follow the sun for our clients, and groups in Chennai and Bangalore in India as well. Our CRO headquarters is in Frankfurt. And you can see from this slide that our expertise covers absolutely the life sciences, and the life sciences specifically in clinical, regulatory, and safety. And as I mentioned, we have consulting, technology, and services, but we also have some really great networks. And quite often these webinars are delivered as a Navitas network webinar where we would present benchmarking information. That's not that kind of webinar today. You may have seen in that glorious panel of logos from Avoca that Navitas Life Sciences is a member of Avoca, and we are very pleased to be one. And so that's a little bit about both Avoca and Navitas. We would like to get to know a bit about you now, which is our first polling question. We'd love to know what type of company you belong to. Are you all sponsor companies out there? Are you all CROs? We hear quite often, well, the addendum doesn't really kind of impact me very much because my CRO does everything. So we'd love to know if you're on the sharp end of that, or whether you're a small pharma, large pharma. Do let us know. The poll should be on the right-hand side of your screen. That'll be where the chat and the Q&A panel is.
Yep. We have about 65% of folks who have responded so far. Very good.
What do our results look like? I can't see the results.
Yeah, so the responses are we have about 19% large pharma and small pharma representatives. We have about 9% mid-sized pharma, and then 6% mid-sized CROs, and then 3% large and small CROs, and then there is an 11% other there. Good.
Excellent. So I can see the results now. So this will be obviously an incredibly relevant hour for you as pharmaceutical companies, majority, and particularly a lot of small companies. I think that's where a lot of the challenges are felt, where resources are constrained, and it's not always easy to see a way through the regulations. So let's have a kind of high-level overview of the regulations themselves. And I think a really important component is this quality by design. So not just sort of adding in extra things from new regulations, but really planning right from the start, using that profound knowledge that you have on your own trials, using historical data, and actually using that for your decision-making processes with a quality focus. And when something happens, things always go wrong, actually looking at the root cause of that. There's obviously a really strong risk-based component to the new regulations, and that's really commensurate with a focus on things that matter. And it's very hard to know what matters when you have, I think Ken Getz's data commented on the fact that the average phase 3 trial generates nearly 1 million data points. And if you have 9 months of wearable data, that's 1 billion data points per patient. So it's really important to be able to focus in amongst all of that noise on the really critical data in your trial. And that means that you need to have really good oversight of your CROs and have a really good understanding of what you're going to do with your risks. And that obviously leads on to oversight itself. And as you can imagine, with that volume of data, you can only really manage that well with electronic systems. We're still in an age where Excel and email is sometimes our go-to method, but under the new regulations with the requirement to use things like quality tolerance limits and manage data from a risk-based approach, that's very difficult. Again, I mentioned things obviously do go wrong, and the regulatory authorities would like to know when it goes wrong. And then another area of quite common inspection findings is in essential documents, essential records. So there's been an update to Alcoa now, so we have Alcoa C. And the important thing is to document what you're doing. There's very little in the new regulations that tells you how you should do things. That's very definitely up to the sponsors. They can't delegate responsibility. They can't outsource that. So it's up to each sponsor to make a decision and document how they are going to perform their risk management processes, for example. And that's a good segue to hand back to Chrissy, who's going to talk about those very key steps that are outlined on how to take a risk-based approach.
Yeah, so the Avoca group has done what we call the 12 steps to ICH 6R2 compliance. And the idea is that 8 to 12 steps that are clearly outlined within the regulations, and we've mapped them to the components that we have in our AQC Knowledge Center. So while Janet outlined the important changes to ICHE 6R2, here we have the map of all the components of risk-based approaches to clinical trial conduct that are now expected by the regulatory authorities. So the regulation was updated after 20 years, particularly as a result of the increase in technology use that Janet discussed. So if you think of where we are as an industry 20 years ago, we were still operating in very paper-based systems, but the technologies that we have today, eTMF, electronic data capture, wearables, and even more, it really makes real-time feedback of processes and data reviews much more feasible. And as a result of that, the regulators were adapting to that and requiring that we utilize these technologies in our design and conduct in order to more efficiently and effectively design the processes and procedures of all phases of clinical trial operations. So as a result of this update, all procedures and processes that are used within clinical trial execution are expected to be documented within the trial master file and undergo an ongoing review, resulting in documented refinements or updates as required. So that is really the basis of ICHE 6R2. And one thing that we want to capture from the audience now is, now that we've gone through a quick update, which everybody's aware, but we're all on the same page of what ICHE 6R2 means, I want to open up another polling question just to feel, get a gut feel of everyone on the line of where they feel their organization is, and if you feel your organization is ICHE 6R2 compliant. So we'll wait about 10 more seconds. About 50% of the respondents in now. 5 more seconds. Okay. So I'll close the poll at the moment. And it's really about what we would expect to see. So for the most part, everybody feels that they're almost ready. And, you know, that really makes sense, because the reality is we have not seen many inspections by the regulatory agencies yet with ICHE 6R2. So what we're going to need to see is whether our interpretations as an industry are lining up with how the regulators are inspecting. So about 43% said feel you're almost ready, 20% feel your organization is compliant and ready, and then there's about 15% of you who said no, 16% who said I don't know, and some NA. So for those of you who said no, we're hoping that we can give you some possible steps to get moving in the right direction. And for those who say I don't know, hopefully we'll be able to sway you in the direction of why it is important. So moving forward, just to talk through some of the challenges. So we actually took a poll at EXL's 7th Annual Quality Oversight event, and there were over 80 participants who responded to the survey. And what we asked them were, what were the biggest challenges that they were experiencing at their organization in trying to take the steps necessary to move towards ICHE 6R2 compliance? So what steps or what hurdles were they facing in trying to get the organization to move forward? It's pretty clear that this was a major change. We've been operating the same way for 20 years. We kind of knew what to do, and now we're in a place where we have to really move from that state of fighting fires every day to more proactive approaches. And I think we're in a state now where the regulators are expecting that. So if you look at the challenges that came through, we put them into 3 buckets here of change management, vendor oversight, and data-driven decisions. So some of the feedback that we got from these industry professionals was that from an organizational change management perspective, it was tough to get leadership buy-in. And that's because the CEOs, CMOs, et cetera, don't necessarily think of quality from the day-to-day perspective, but they want to see the big picture. And the million-dollar question in our industry is, what's the cost of quality and what's the cost of mitigating these risks before they happen, as opposed to the cost if they are not mitigated, and that risk becomes an issue which ultimately has an effect on the business. In addition, there's this move of ownership of quality within each function. So the idea there is that quality is no longer just something that's QA's concern, and that they're going to clean it up and they're going to deal with it before the inspectors come. You know, ICH 6R2 is really mandating that everybody is a part of the quality process and the improvement of those processes throughout the clinical trial execution phase. In addition, a lot of the challenge that we heard from organizations is that really everybody has their day jobs and they're working hard fighting those fires every day. We understand that this industry is in a race to move forward, a race to heal patients, a race against one another to get their products to market. So with everybody working so hard on their day jobs, there is some struggle with finding the resourcing required that's really necessary to sit down, to analyze those internal processes, to see how they are in compliance or not with ICH SAR2, and really to make those changes in a thoughtful way so that it's successful with the maturity level of each organization. And lastly, there's training and implementation. So I think based on the survey results we saw earlier, there was a lot of people that said, yeah, I don't know if we're ICH 6R2 compliant. And I think sometimes that I don't know is just because there's not a clear understanding throughout the entire organization of the importance of it and what exactly it means and really how it's different than what we're doing today. So the next bucket we had was oversight. So there's the constant issue, and you know, Avoca was, the Quality Consortium was really founded on the differing opinions of sponsor and vendor expectations, and ultimately that's really because oftentimes there's not clear alignment on what processes are going to be followed when doing clinical trial execution. In addition, there needs to be assurance of cross-functional alignment on these quality priorities. So which things are most important to the sponsor who's outsourcing some of the tasks of their clinical trials. And last, and certainly not least, is that ICH 6R2 is really requiring data-driven decision-making. So a lot of the question around ICH 6R2 compliance and an organization's ability to do that is around identifying quality metrics and more specifically quality tolerance limits. So there is a need and a desire with ICH 6R2 to make sure that quality tolerance limits are defined at the start of the study, and ultimately there's a corresponding action associated with it. So if you reach that limit, there is an action that has to be taken. It must be documented. So getting those identified is a little bit difficult for an industry that really likes data and likes to collect a lot of data, as Janet talked about in the beginning. So it's important to proactively identify what's important. And lastly, as part of that data-driven decision, there's ensuring that the right technology tools are available to evaluate risk. Again, putting a huge, large CTMS system might not really be the right answer for an organization that's running one clinical trial that's a phase 1. So there needs to be a match of the technology that you're using to make sure that it's real time, you can see it, but at the same time, you know, it's economic and efficient for the organization and the scale that you're in at that point in time. So what we're going to do for you now is break down these challenges that we've heard from the industry and really talk through those challenges and some of the solutions that we've found for organizations that we've worked with in a consulting capacity or through our Quality Consortium.
Thank you, Chrissy. So I'm going to give a really brief introduction to change management, but then as Chrissy said, we'll have a bit of a discussion on the slide after this on what the best approaches are. So this is a word cloud that's been created from a very comprehensive article on change management, and I think for me it reflects the complexity in this task, and that it is this amazing mixture of process and people and management. And so, as Chrissy mentioned, some of the key components that we see when we're helping companies on their journey through change management is that issue of leadership buy-in. who owns quality. It's very easy to say, well, that's the function over there called quality, but really recognizing that quality by design is something greater than just a siloed function. And having the resources available, it's an incredible challenge to change how we work. And as Chrissy said, everybody has their day job, so trying to find resourcing is always an issue. So on to the next slide, what are the solutions? We've mentioned it 100 times, including the leadership in the solution is absolutely key. We hear quite often that quality can be the sort of voice of doom at C-level discussions where there is a sort of continual request for more funding with the fear of compliance and inspection findings. And I think it's important to turn it around and say, if we weren't spending an enormous amount of money on checking every data point with 100% source data verification, if we reduced that into the risk-based approach, where else could we spend that money? Where else could we gain efficiencies? Where else could we improve the quality of our studies? So explaining why it's important is really key. In terms of build branding and the map, so change management is a journey. It's very hard sometimes to know when you've reached the end of that journey, and so everybody needs a map for what that process is going to look like. And those maps will be different for different functions. So data management will have a map that has, for example, that technology landscape in it. Clinical operations will have a very different map, more associated with risk management and trying to get those cross-functional teams together, particularly at the start. But it's very difficult to bring those different functions and silos together, all with their different maps. So what can be very useful is to build a brand around that initiative. So this could be your ICH-GCP R2 health check, but everybody can talk about the health check that's going on to improve the health of clinical operations and clinical trial management. And everybody gets very much behind that at the start, and everybody's really enthusiastic, and they've got their map, and they've got their brand and their name for the project. When it actually comes down to sort of competing with your day job and putting yourself into the implementation stage, that's when you need that energy and that commitment from leadership who can reach across those silos and keep that momentum going. And finally, when you do have really proactive solution finding activities going on, those need rewarding. So getting people empowered and taking ownership of the initiatives within their function is really, really important. And recognizing that this isn't just quality's issue, but this is about having more efficient risk-based clinical trials, which ultimately has a much better outcome for the patients on those studies. Chrissy, would you add anything to that?
I think that was really great. But tying in, I think the organizational change management is also, how to have effective oversight. I think that is an area that as an industry, most organizations really struggle with, both before and after ICH E6R2. It's what I like to refer to as the Goldilocks challenge. So as an industry, we often ask those that previously have done the work to move into a role of overseeing the work, and it's quite a different skill set. So as a result, there's organizations as a whole or within certain functional areas of vendor oversight that end up on one spectrum or the other that you see here. So they're either overseeing at such a high level. The example here we show is that, they're asking if database lock is still set for February 2021 when we're still at the feasibility state in March of 2018. Or they're so far in the weeds that they're micromanaging the CRO. And really each side of this scale has their own set of negative impacts. So being so high level and not engaged, you risk missing the risk indicators that turn into issues which could jeopardize patient safety, regulatory findings, and really the organization's industry reputation. On the other end of the spectrum, if you're so far in the weeds, the efficiency that you're looking to gain from outsourcing the work on the clinical trial is lost. So the question then becomes, how do organizations have effective oversight? And there are a few key areas that need to be agreed on in advance of any trial taking place. And the first is training and implementation. So the training and implementation component is an ongoing piece requirement for effective oversight. A sponsor organization needs to be able to ensure that the resources performing activities on the clinical trial are adequately trained on the tasks and that they're performing. So this is both within the sponsor organization and the external provider. So the reason for that is that the sponsor organization has to make sure that their staff that's overseeing the provider are trained in what's expected of them when they're overseeing. So oftentimes, as I said, we are dealing with organizations where people used to do those tasks and now they're overseeing them. So we need to make sure that they're trained on what the expectations are when they're overseeing these organizations and what the expectations are when things are going off the rails. So if they need to escalate issues, they need to be trained on how to do that. So in addition, ICH 6R2 places the onus on the sponsor to ensure that the outsourced resources are also adequately trained on the aspects of the trial that they're performing. So tying in closely with training and implementation is roles and responsibilities. So we need to clearly articulate the roles and responsibilities within and between a sponsor and the partners to make sure that there's efficient execution and effective oversight. We want to make sure that we're minimizing duplication of efforts and micromanagement. We're ensuring accountability for activities performed and ultimately enhancing the successful delivery of the outsourced project. We don't want to be stepping on each other's toes, and we don't want to be doing the same task multiple times. It just delays the trial. It costs more money. All of the things that we're looking to reduce when we're outsourcing. But the roles and responsibilities should be understood throughout the organization as well as the partner to drive oversight and efficient clinical operations. So as a result, much like everything that we're talking about, it really falls into the quality by design, and it's quality by the design of the partnership. So those roles and responsibilities have to really be proactively defined and thought out before the project work begins. And then, in line with ICH 6R2, it needs to be refined and enhanced on a periodic basis. So oftentimes the roles and responsibilities may shift throughout a trial based on newly recognized risks or issues that have been addressed throughout CAPAs. So we talked about training, we talked about roles and responsibilities, so we basically have talked about the people who are doing the work and how they're learning to do the work, but we also have to look closely at the alignment of the sponsor and vendor processes. So again, this is proper planning to align on what SOPs, policies, procedures are going to be followed during the conduct of the clinical trial. So it should be documented with a formal agreement, either a quality agreement or a joint quality management plan of sorts, to ensure that there's a clear understanding on what procedures are to be followed. And again, in light of the risk-based approaches, this document is something that needs to be revisited frequently throughout the trial to update, refine, and modify as necessary. And basically, those risk reviews of these plans even need to be documented as required by R2. And lastly, we've talked about this quite a few times, but oftentimes you're looking to outsource to decrease the burden on your resources within your organization, or to gain some efficiencies because of some outside knowledge and expertise. So your goal is to really be overseeing and not shadowing your CRO. So in order to do that, there needs to be a clear understanding of all the above components so that there's trust and faith in the risk-based approach to identify and mitigate the potential risks before they become an issue. Without all the parties involved understanding their role, the process to be followed, and basically being adequately trained on all of these, the oversight scale is going to be unbalanced throughout. So the Avoca Quality Consortium actually created our swim lane image, which you see here. So this is the 8 key components of a quality oversight. So this is our framework. And you'll see the components are governance, technical oversight, process oversight, communication, oversight leadership requirements, metrics, analytics, technology, roles, responsibilities, and proactive risk opportunity management. There's over 300 tools and templates available in the quality management framework for an organization to adapt its fit-for-purpose tools to ensure effective quality oversight. And the key is that there's a variety of documents, and the documents are scalable so they fit the needs and the maturity of the organization. So in order to be successful at oversight, the oversight framework being used has to fit the scale. Otherwise, you're in a situation where it's going to be overly burdensome or too high level. So again, we're constantly working with that balance here, and those risk reviews are what are going to make it able for us to do that. So we've talked about the challenges, and now we can talk about some of the solutions we've seen over our consulting engagements. So a key to aligning the process is, again, to assure that your processes are aligned. So as stated earlier, putting in place at the start of a collaboration or a partnership, a quality management plan that outlines the key processes that should be followed. It needs to be formalized, stored in the TMF, and all members operating within the partnership should have training on the SOPs that they're going to be following. It's something that we frequently see done by organizations, so these quality management plans are there, they exist. The problem is that it's a one-and-done document. So ICH 6R2 requires these risk-based approaches, which means that the document has to be revisited throughout the life cycle of the relationship and the trial. So the subsequent reviews of the plan also need to be documented. So it's likely that if an inspector comes in to review and they see a quality management plan that's dated March 2018, and that's the last time it was shown to be reviewed or finalized or signed, and they're auditing this in 2022, there's probably going to be some concerns on whether that was really keeping up with and updated throughout the duration of the trial. Similarly, one of the key issues that we've talked about extensively is making sure that we're overseeing and not shadowing. And the key to doing that is making sure that as an organization, you're reviewing the appropriate pieces of data to identify any key risks and issues. And again, prior to starting the study, that means there's a need to identify those key quality metrics that are necessary for tracking, as well as their corresponding metrics taxonomy. Taxonomy is important because we don't want just a collection of KPIs and KQIs, but we want to identify what thresholds go along with those metrics to indicate that some sort of action should take place or a risk is near realization. So these metrics are effectively warning signs and a way of proactively mitigating that risk that we have. So it's tied to data-driven decision-making, which is one of those other challenges that we'll be speaking to next. But lastly, and one other thing that we want to discuss is you have to make sure that it's clearly defined, the roles and responsibilities, so that you have the right people doing the right things, ultimately at the right time. You know, an example would be our medical monitors signing off on eligibility forms, or is the project manager at your CRO? There needs to be a clear outline of who's doing what, so there's comfort that any potential risks are mitigated by the experience and expertise of those people performing those tasks. So on top of making sure that there's training on that, there also needs to be some really excellent knowledge management throughout the partnering organizations to ensure that the right information is getting to the right people at the right time. So a key to a successful partnership is making sure that those shared learnings, both within the program or within other programs that are operating under the same partnership, are preventing recurring or preventable errors. So if there aren't any questions here, we'll move to Janet, who will discuss the last key challenge that we have on the docket for today.
Thank you, Chrissy. I'm absolutely passionate about this topic. I absolutely love it. I think Ken gets his data again shows that the typical clinical trial has data embedded in somewhere between 5 to 6 different systems, and I'm sure everybody on the call today knows that those systems don't always talk to each other very well. So one of the key issues that we have in being able to make decisions from our data in near real time is that it's almost impossible to get that data in near real time in a format that's comprehensible to human beings. So the image that was just up on the screen there was the importance of data aggregation. And if you've brought your data all together in one place, and as Chrissy has touched on, defining what's really important, the monitoring that data is absolutely key. And I'm not going to talk too much about quality tolerance limits because we do have a poll coming up in the next slide, so I'm going to ask you about quality tolerance limits. But as I mentioned, accessing and integrating your data from multiple sources really is a challenge that we hear and we see in the industry quite often, even for the large companies who have access to perhaps a wider range of technology. They can end up with multiple technologies and have almost duplicated the issue of having more siloed systems and processes that don't always work all the way across. So having that cross-functional alignment on your quality priorities is really important. And I mean, the whole topic is having the right technology tools available to evaluate your risk at the same time is really important. So with a view on quality tolerance limits, which are so essential to managing your clinical trial, we would love to know whether you find it challenging to define and implement quality tolerance limits. So are you completely happy? We know there are companies out there that have taken a risk-based approach to monitoring for 3 or 4 years now, and so I imagine they're very familiar with setting quality tolerance limits to know what they need to study. Is everybody in that place, or are there people out there finding it challenging, or perhaps you're not completely familiar with what a quality tolerance limit is, in which case you can choose option C. And if it's absolutely outside your sphere of influence, it's not applicable to you, then you have option D as well.
Yep, we still have some results coming in, so let's give them 10 more seconds.
They take a while to flip up on my screen, but they do, so I can't wait to see the answer.
4, 3, 2, 1, I'll close the poll. There you go, the results should be up. Yep.
I can't see them yet. What do they say?
Sure, so right now the results are that 63% are a yes, 9% are a no, 17% say I don't know what a QTL is, and 7% say not applicable.
I can see them now. I'm not surprised. We had a similar question at the Clinical Quality Oversight Forum just last week. And despite the fact that quality tolerance limits are a required component of the new regulations, quite clearly spelled out, and therefore a legal requirement in the EU for 8 months now, the audience at that meeting equally split, actually. 2/3 of the audience finding it incredibly challenging to manage QTLs and implement them. So then a key question around quality tolerance limits is our next poll on how many of these do you have? If you're not implementing them yet, if you're finding it so challenging that you don't have them, then please feel free to answer that question from your own personal perspective, how many you feel is the ideal number. Obviously, if you think your company uses 30 and you think they should use 3, you can go with your own personal decision or your company's decision, whichever you prefer. And again, I am fascinated to know the answer to this question.
There's lots of polling coming in right now, so we'll leave it open for a few more seconds here.
It's lovely to see that the snow hasn't put you all off. You're still alive and awake. Fantastic.
And Christy and Jan, it will just take a few seconds after we close for it to appear on the screen.
All right, one more second, I'll close the poll. And those results should be available for everyone to see now. All right, so we had about 10% of you who said you're using less than 5, 13 who are using between 5 and 20, 2% who are using greater than 20, 22% say you don't know how many you're using, and 8% of you still don't know what a QTL is, which hopefully we can enlighten you very shortly.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting that of the people who know how many they're typically using, the majority of the responses come into group B, so between 5 and 20. And if I move on to the next slide, one of the really key differences that separates a quality tolerance limit, QTL, from a key risk indicator is that a QTL is a study level risk indicator. It isn't a site level or patient level risk indicator. It's a study level. So these are the things that are absolutely critical to your data integrity and your patient safety and your primary endpoints. So if you're trying to track nearly 20 of them, that is in itself a risk to the study. And so a QTL, the Transcelerate paper on the topic, recommends around 3 to 5. And the new regulations require that you have a documented action that demonstrates what you will do if your quality tolerance limit reaches a certain threshold. So there's an awful lot of information from the manufacturing industry that can guide us in this, and I think it's really valuable to take the learning from different industries because they've been doing this for decades and they have a really good understanding about having a threshold where you say this is a warning threshold, I need to be more alert to this. But if it then crosses a second threshold, that's when you have to take action. And that's what the regulators are looking for, that you have a documented action and that you will then go back and look at the root cause analysis, because the goal of QTLs is to pick up systemic risks. It's things that will be affecting your study and make it very hard to draw the right conclusions from your results. So if you're looking for systemic risks and you've got nearly 20 of them, again, probably have bigger issues. So you should have between 3 and 5 QTLs with a documented action of what you will do if they cross a threshold and a very clear action plan to look into the root cause. The key risk indicators may be things that are just good to know. What's the recruitment rate? If time to market is key for you, then there may be a risk indicator around slow recruitment that you might want to know about at the site level. You may simply track that if speed to market is not the key goal, and so it might just be something you want to know, but the regulators aren't going to be having findings if your recruitment rates are slower than you would like. But the QTLs are the really important ones, and there's a link there, so when we send out the slides, you'll be able to have a read of that document to give you a bit more information on Transcelerate's view of how to use QTLs. And I think, sounding like an echo chamber, but having the appropriate technology to support is absolutely key, because you can't obviously live calculate where your mean protocol deviation number per site is in a huge phase 3 study. You need to have the technology to bring that data together in really easy to see dashboards, and there are many different technology tools out there at the moment that enable you to overcome silos, and they are appropriate to different company stages. So I think the sort of key message in all of these 3 buckets that we've talked through is on the next slide, and it's about that continuous improvement. So if you can get a little bit better every day, that's a really good place to start. So I'm going to hand over to Chrissy to see if we've got any more questions from you.
Yeah, I think this is a great time to take a pause. You know, the good thing about AQC 6R2 is that it's clear that perfection is not expected from the start. So the concept is that there should be this constant improvement in processes throughout the duration of the clinical trial so that the issues aren't repeating themselves. So if we're continuously improving our processes, procedures throughout the duration of the trial and we're documenting it, we are in effect in compliance with AQC 6R2. So with that being said, before we talk about how to move forward, Lisa, are there any questions from the audience that you think would be worth addressing at the moment?
There are. Here's one question that came in a few minutes ago, and that is, which components of risk-based monitoring do you recommend, or RBM, do you recommend that sponsors retain control of when outsourcing study management to CROs. For example, pre-study, risk planning, central monitoring of risks, KRIs, et cetera.
Did you want to take your first stab at that question, Janet?
I can do. I had one thought that came into my head at the start of that question, but then a different one at the end. I'm trying to group my thoughts. I think a very key part of the answer is what Chrissy touched on earlier, that you have to align what you're doing with your CRO. So from a risk planning perspective, you are required to demonstrate that you as a sponsor have been involved in the problem-solving aspect of the trial. So the CRO didn't just go away for the next 15 months and beaver away in the background and appear with solutions to problems without some documentation that you are involved in that process. So I think the risk planning is the very key first step to that, to sit down with the protocol and look at the risks, because as the sponsor you will have really profound knowledge about the molecule that you're looking at. You may have history of previous studies that you didn't do with that CRO. But the CRO will have all of that knowledge of operational risks in that area from a huge number of CROs. So I think it has to be a shared process, absolutely. And I think in terms of the technology, it's very easy now with some of the technology available for the sponsor to have that dashboard view so that you can see what's going on. And that's a good place to start that dialogue without having necessarily to have ownership of thousands of lab results coming directly into the sponsor. That's not the answer.
Yes. Yeah, I think you did a great job answering that question, and that's the key. I think planning with your CRO on how you intend to monitor from that risk-based perspective is fine, and continuously reaching back out to follow up on how it's going is acceptable. So they can operationalize it and they can perform all the tasks, but as a sponsor organization, you're going to need to be involved in the planning of how it's going to be done, and then also ensuring that the process is going as expected. Any other questions, Lisa?
Yes, we have a few. I don't know if we'll get through them all, so I just want to let you all know that we will be following up with any questions that are asked. So continue to put them in the Q&A section, and we will reach back out to you. So another question that was asked are, what are some ways that you've seen organizations successfully get leadership to buy in?
I can take this one. Really good question. Oftentimes when we do our consulting work at Avoca and we work with organizations both large and small to really get quality management systems in place, what we like to do is perform a gap analysis, and we have readouts, and we come up with the plan, as Janet talked about, to move forward. And we meet with those that are really going to be operating to that plan, and we talk through with them and get their buy-in on how to move forward. And that's typically a 2-day process, and what we like to do is we like to invite that senior leadership to 15 minutes, so we don't take much of their time, but we really like to present to them, here's our path forward, here's the current gaps, here's what they mean to you from whatever role it is that they're sitting in. If it's a CEO, here's what it means for these upcoming studies that we're trying to get completed to take this drug to market. And we tell them, here's our path forward, and ultimately, here are some of the asks that you might hear from us along the way. And that could be resources to help get the new SOPs or processes drafted or written, or the templates drafted and written. It could be just asking for their buy-in in sending out recognition emails or awards to those who are operating under a more proactive, risk-based approach, as opposed to rewarding the person who's there firefighting at 10 o'clock at night because an issue actually came to realization. So it's having those leadership, high-level leadership folks really sending the message of this is really where we want to be and rewarding that.
Okay, I have another question, and this is a super good question because I know there are several folks on the call that fall into this category. And that is, where does a small biotech start? This person in the respondent said we have an old SOP that did not evolve with company changes, and no GCP quality department, and only one GMP in the quality. So a follow-up was, additionally, we have no electronic systems and are a department of 3 people.
I love the small biotech. They're just awesome and incredibly brave. You have kind of the perfect clean slate, and there are very, very simple electronic TMS systems that are out there now. So again, technology appropriate to the stage of the company. You don't have to go with what the global top 10 guys will be using. But I think one really good place to start, and it answers the previous question as well about getting leadership buy-in, is you can do a very, very quick and relatively easy gap analysis. So you can hand over your SOPs to Avoca or Navitas and say, where are my gaps? And that's a really great starting point. And we work with an industry expert to do projects like this, who does this awesome kind of, you can do a maturity matrix. So in a very quick, very visual way, you can present to your leaders, this is where the industry is in terms of compliance against R2, this is where we are. And that's a really useful tool for leaders to say, okay, how much better do we want to get against all of these categories? Where do we need to put most effort in because we have most risk? And you already start to then have those dialogues with your leaders, and you've already got a package of SOPs that you know need amending or new ones written or whatever needs to be done so that you've got the documentation right. And that puts you in a really good place to then start building the map for really implementing quality by design and risk-based monitoring. So I would suggest that as the first step, to do that gap analysis.
Okay.
Yes. I would suggest that we move forward a little bit more, and we have some more Q&A at the end.
I was just going to suggest that. Great.
Excellent. So the last thing we want to talk about, we talked through some of the challenge and we talked through some of the solutions, and I think that the question that was just asked about the small biotech really lends itself to, well, what's the next step for me personally in my organization, and how do we move forward? How do you move forward and provoke organizational change to move from a state of constant firefighting to a state of proactive quality management? And as we talked about a little bit, the idea is to start at the top. You have to get commitment from that senior management team. The goal is to build an organization committed to quality and not just within the quality assurance group. That's what we have to move away from. And the way to do that is to ensure that the leadership isn't rewarding that firefighting. So by not rewarding that PM that's there until 7 o'clock, but instead commending the PM who's escalated the risk that was about to become an issue, we're changing the message of what is going to be the future state of that organization. So the idea is, in doing that, we trickle down organization-wide that the change is important. The next step would be
to start early, preferably yesterday. The regulations have been law in the EU for many months now, but also start early at the protocol development stage. It's still relatively normal in our industry that the protocol isn't quite finalized. The database release is happening late when the patients are already being recruited. And we need to just, as Chrissy has highlighted, change the way we approach this to stop firefighting and start at the protocol development stage to assess the risk from the patient's perspective. Walk through that trial. What does it feel like from the patient's perspective? And the MHRA 9-question framework is a really good one for that. So your risk assessment could be as simple as that. It doesn't have to be the full rack if you're a small biotech and you want something that's a bit simpler, but start early.
The next is to start with the numbers. So you have to look and see the data. And, you know, as an organization, oftentimes we're really focused on the next milestone. So first patient in, all sites activated, database lock, preparing for the inspection. And we forget to really look at all of the things throughout that might show when a problem is coming. So the idea is that we need to start with the numbers, we need to look at the data, and focus on what matters. And most importantly, there's really a necessity to act when the numbers change. So oftentimes as organizations, we collect tons and tons of data points and metrics, but we're not actually doing anything when we see them really straying from the norm. And I think that we can all think of a couple of key metrics that, you know, we definitely act on. If recruitment rate isn't up to par, then you're likely giving your CRO project manager a call, or if the patient's data is not cleaned within a certain time, you're definitely giving your CRO a call. But there's so much more outside of that, those really timeline-provoking metrics that really should be collected and analyzed. And the reality is you shouldn't be really collecting any metrics that aren't actionable. And that is the goal with collecting these metrics and looking at them. So if you're getting the correct metrics to the right people so that they can see where the risk might be realized and they can create some action, that's the key. You don't want to be sending a spreadsheet of 100 metrics to your medical monitor if only 10 of them are relevant. That's how things sort of fall through the cracks.
And then finally, with this wealth of information that we've bombarded you with, don't look for perfection. It's a really key part of the regulations to continuously improve. So put something in place and analyze how it does, and as Chrissy said, act when the numbers change. A really good framework to have in mind for that is the Deming Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle. We're very good at planning and doing and implementing those plans, and again, as Chrissy said, we're not as good at then analyzing. Well, our numbers are telling us something different. We have to change what we're doing and then implement something new. So the QTL information in the Transcelerate paper, the reporting requirements and the new regulations, they all state, put in your CSR how you performed against your QTLs. If you have to change them, you may have to change the thresholds. That's absolutely fine. You can document what happens if you go above the thresholds. Don't look for perfection. And I think a really good metric at the end there to leave you with is that if you as an organization feel confident that you're taking a really good risk-based approach, that you're keeping an eye on your quality tolerance limits, that your data is aggregated and you can make decisions in near real time, then there is no point doing 100% SDB. So dropping your percentage SDB can be a really good metric for knowing when you're doing really well. And so the final slide before we go back to some more questions. The first step to getting anywhere is deciding that you're no longer willing to stay where you are. Clearly, the regulatory authorities aren't happy for our industry to stay where it is at the moment, but I'm really thrilled that even from the few questions that we've looked at already, it's clear that the audience today is absolutely willing to move on and make some significant changes. So I would love to hear more of your questions.
All right, we have just a minute or two to pose a question, but and some of these are pretty big questions, more discussions. But here's one. What are the implementation considerations for establishing QTLs and risk reporting in the CSR?
Sorry, what
are the implementation considerations for establishing quality tolerance limits and risk reporting in the CSR?
Yeah, so this is Chrissy, and I want to refer everyone back once again, and these slides will be sent out to everyone afterwards. The Transcelerate paper really does a great job at discussing the do's and don'ts for not only establishing QTLs, but also for risk reporting. I think the key thing, though, as far as implementation is that the reality is it's a must. So much like everything we've talked about today, it doesn't have to be perfect, but you have to start somewhere. So the idea of quality tolerance limits is that they should be based on this study. They should also be based on historical knowledge or information that you have based on the product that you're using. So if you're a small biotech, you might have a quality tolerance limit that is a little bit more of a guess than somebody who's running their 40th trial on the same IP. So the idea is you need to get something down. You need to be able to define or rationalize why it is that that's the number you picked and why you think it's important, and just work towards that. Again, those quality tolerance limits are not something you set at the start of the trial and then don't think about again and just keep acting on them. They can change, and it's important that they change. And as far as the risk reporting, again, that is now a requirement as part of the CSR. So you have to do it. And there's some really great do's and don'ts and suggestions in that Transcelerate paper that I would highly recommend everybody take a quick glance at. You know, some of the general don'ts are that it shouldn't be a separate document. It needs to be included in the CSR. It shouldn't just be a general description of the risk management plan that they're using, and that it shouldn't include insignificant details or minor issues. So the QTLs are set at that trial level, so it should be focused really on those quality issues within that trial. But it's not intended to be a very burdensome piece of your CSR. It's again, succinct and to the point and talking about what you did when you were defining those parameter values and any deviations that may have occurred to those predefined QTLs and what consequences happened as a result of that. Shannon, anything to add? If not, we can move on.
Absolutely perfect. I would have said exactly the same. It should be a succinct table. I think the example they give is if you expect 2% of your population not to meet exclusion or inclusion criteria, is that going to alter the conclusions you make for a wider population when you generalize to put the drug out on the market? And if it does or doesn't, you just document it. And then if you end up with 5 or 10% of your patients not meeting your inclusion or exclusion criteria, then you document that, and you may change your limits, you may ultimately amend the protocol, but to go back and do the root cause analysis on why that is the important thing. But I totally agree with what you said, Chrissy.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining us. We have just one more slide that provides you with some information on some educational opportunities coming up. Next week, the AQC is hosting an open knowledge center demo where you can see a lot of the tools and templates that we have that our members have contributed and we've refined. There's a proactive quality GCP compliance conference coming up the week after, and in April, a quality congress being conducted in conjunction with ACRP, the annual meeting in the Avoca Quality Consortium. So it's pretty exciting. The things that are coming up, we invite you to visit our website so you can find out more information about each of our company's upcoming events. And again, thank you for joining us, and we hope you will join us again soon.
Thank you.